Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture on the nature and difference between possibility and impossibility. What does possibility have to do with critical thinking? Well, it, in a way, limits the bounds of what can be thought. What do you think is ultimately possible? Let your imagination take you as far away from here as you can think. Do you think that the worlds portrayed in popular movies are possible? Could it be possible that we're all in the Matrix? Are the realms of fantasy possible? Could there be dragons and talking lions? Could there be Pokemon? Or even better, could a Pokemon be a detective? If your first thought is to say, wait a minute, none of those things are actually possible, I want to stop you and start to do some critical thinking and philosophy. Now, philosophers love to make distinctions. This is a very important notion that will come up again and again in this class. A distinction gives you at least two things and a distinguishing feature or marker between them. And for this lecture, the important distinction that we're going to be drawing is between the actual and the merely possible. The difference between things that are actual and things that are merely possible. What does it really mean to say that something is actually the case? What does it mean to say something is true right now, or that something currently exists? These are all aspects of what we might call the actual world, the actual facts, the actually existing people, plants, animals, planets, countries, continents, the furniture of the universe, the things that actually exist. Being actual is what sets you and I apart from the things that are merely possible, but not actual. You might think in terms of imaginary or fictional characters, or even imaginary or fictional versions of ourselves. Think about what you had for breakfast this morning. I had a banana. I actually had a banana, right? In the actual world this morning for breakfast, I had a banana. I could have had cereal instead. Well, what does that mean? I could have had cereal instead. Well, it means that it's possible that I had cereal this morning rather than a banana. There is a possible version of me, not the actual one, but there's a possible one that had cereal this morning rather than a banana. Maybe that version of me would have been happier with his life decisions this afternoon, but I can't say, right? I'm not that version of me. Now we can distinguish the actual from the merely possible in the way that I just did. Everyone understands what it is for something to have actually happened, right? You know what it means for, you to have woken up this morning. That actually happened. And everyone understands what it means to say that things could have been a little bit different, right? They could have been a little different than they actually are, right? You could have woken up 5 minutes later, or to your alarm, or to the sound of, to the sunrise. But what exactly does this mean, that things could be different than they actually are? Well, it means that there's a difference from the things that are actual and the things that are merely possible. Things that are merely possible are not actual. They never happened. They could never happen. Or, I mean, they could have happened, but they didn't, right? Now they can never happen again, right? They could have happened, though, in the past, maybe. And so whatever sort of magic stuff of the universe was needed to make the actual stuff happen instead of the merely possible stuff happen, it happened, and something actually happened, making all of the other things that could have happened merely possible and not actual. Now, this is, of course, a confusing sort of word salad, but the idea here should be hopefully clear. The things that actually happened. The things that could have happened but didn't actually happen are the things that are merely possible. They could have happened, but they didn't happen. They are no longer possibilities in one sense. They are merely possibilities, and they didn't occur. Now, I say merely possible because it's certainly true that whatever actually happened was itself possible among the possibilities. It must have been possible because it really happened, right? If it wasn't possible, it would have been impossible and could not have happened. So there's another distinction that we also need to make between the possible and the merely possible. Possible things include the current actual moment, but things that are merely possible don't include what is actual. Here's another way of thinking about it, with maybe a helpful visual cue. Imagine God is planning out the universe and all of time from heaven. Now, you don't have to actually believe in God to imagine this scenario, but bear with me. It basically looks like the universe looks like a giant network of long strands of time, all of them meeting in one center place, which is the here and now, right? God's kind of acting from the here and now and sees all these strands before him. And then behind the here and now, there's one strand, right? It's the special strand that is the past, right? That's the way that things actually happened, right? Now, each of these many strands shooting off into the future of time are one way that the future might be, right? Branching off from the here and now. And God sees that among all of these strands of time, there are a number of different options. So, say for me, when it comes to my breakfast, one of the strands when it comes for me is banana. One is cereal. One is a toast. One is bagel. Maybe just coffee. But God sees that I'm going to choose the banana, right? And then I choose the banana. And once he realizes that that's the only strand that's going to be actual, what he can do is, moving through once we get to the here and now, that is my breakfast this morning, he can cut all the other strands off, and making, only the strand where I chose the banana to be the actual strand. Now, of course, though, he can leave all the other strands kind of dangling there nearby. They're just not on the actual timeline anymore, but they're there, right? They're the mere possibilities that are left behind, the things that could have happened had I chose differently. Sticking with this sort of God's eye view thought experiment, we can take it a little bit further. Suppose God went back to the time of the dinosaurs and made them all bright pink. That's the kind of thing that's possible, right? If God exists, he could have done that. Or maybe, what if God made all the dinosaurs furry and mammalian rather than reptilian? That feels like something that's possible for God to do, right? Everything is possible with God, right? Or what if God went back to the Big Bang and instead he had it all happen a little differently? He changed how the physics works so that in the universe, gravity pushes things apart rather than pulling them together. Do you think that that's possible in some sense? Or have we gone too far and now we're talking about things that are impossible? Well, that's really all going to depend on what we mean when we say that something is possible or impossible. When we say that something is impossible, we usually mean that it's not possible. But we say quite often that things are impossible when they really are possible in some way, right? Take this simple example. Suppose you are trying to dunk a basketball, but you're 5'5", you're 15 years old, and you've never been very good at jumping. You might say to your coach or to your friends, "It's impossible for me to dunk the basketball." Is what you say true in this context? Certainly, it's possible to dunk a basketball, right? People in the NBA dunk basketballs all the time. But in this context, you don't mean that it's always and for everyone impossible to dunk a basketball. You mean that it's impossible, given your current situation, for you to dunk a basketball. When it comes to saying that certain things are possible or impossible, it turns out that context is key. When someone says that something is possible or impossible, you can always ask, unless it's truly obvious, possible with respect to what? There are different things that are possible under different ways of thinking. For example, It's not possible to go faster than the speed of light, according to the laws of modern physics. The speed of light is ultimately the universe's speed limit. It's also possible to fly on a broomstick in the imaginary realm of Harry Potter. It's maybe not in the real world, but it is in this imaginary world. It's not possible for a human person to turn into a dolphin biologically, right? According to the rules of biology. But is it possible for a person to become a dolphin? Is it possible for something to go faster than light? And if all these things are in some sense possible, what in the world is not possible? Now, it does seem true to say that it's impossible for a 15-year-old that's 5'5" with no jump training to be able to dunk a basketball, right? It seems true when you think about it to say that. But why does this seem true, right? Is it really impossible in all senses? I mean, I can imagine it happening. There's, of course, the sense in which it couldn't happen in the actual world, in reality. But I can imagine, God changing the world to be a little bit different, basketball hoops being a little bit lower to the ground, gravity being a little bit less strong. What we mean when we say that something is impossible is that that thing is not possible according to some set of restrictions. Often those restrictions are implicit in what we say. They go unsaid because they are obvious from the context in which we're talking. When we say that it's impossible for a 15-year-old to dunk the basketball in this sense, we mean sort of in the current context, in reality, in the actual world, given the actual laws of physics, given the actual restrictions that are on a 5'5" body and somebody that hasn't ever trained in jumping. Philosophers love to strip away implicit assumptions that we make in context. And basically that's what's going on here. Philosophers, and like lawyers often too, love to take what we say literally and ultimately won't assume any of the contextual restrictions that you might be building in implicitly to what you're saying. They won't assume them unless you actually say them explicitly. You actually verbalize them. Now, if we strip away all implicit restrictions on what we're thinking when we're thinking about whether or not something is possible or impossible, is there anything left? That is, does it make sense to say that something is impossible simplicator, like impossible no matter what? Impossible in every instance under every way of thinking about things? Or does it just turn out that everything is possible in some sense as long as we remove the restrictions? Philosophers think yes, and that's because there's ultimately got to be some foundational restriction to what we will call logical possibility and impossibility. And by logical impossibility, philosophers tend to mean something that ultimately some things are impossible because they violate the fundamental laws of logic. And the fundamental laws of logic are so basic and so necessary that nothing can ultimately go against them and still exist or be true or make any sense. These fundamental laws of logic, or the basic laws of thought, are the most fundamental to our thinking. They're fundamental to our being able to make sense of the world and to the way that the world really is. Now, the basic laws to logical thinking are threefold, and they were introduced initially by Aristotle, a great philosopher of antiquity. First, we have the law of non-contradiction, which says that nothing can both have a property and lack that property at the same time. Second, we have the law of identity, which says that everything is self-identical or identical with itself. And finally, the law of excluded middle, which says that for any particular property, everything either has that property or lacks that property. Let's begin by talking about the law of non-contradiction, which says that nothing can both have a property and lack a property at the same time, or that same property. Now, of course, first of all, let's explain what a property is. Properties are basically just the features of objects or individuals. For example, there's the property of being round, of being red, of being 4 foot tall, of being a number, being 22 years old, etc. Any way that something can be is a property of that thing. Now, the law of non-contradiction claims that nothing can both have a property and lack the same property at the same time, sort of in the same way. The law implies that it is ultimately impossible for anything, no matter what, to ever have and lack the same property at the same time. So, for example, it's impossible for something to be round and not round at the same time. Similarly, if we were to define, the phrase, or let's define being square as having 4 equal sides, and let's define being round as having no sides, then it would be impossible for something to be both round and square at the same time, because ultimately that would be like saying that the thing has 4 sides and has no sides, right? And that would be, a contradiction in a way. Now, the law of non-contradiction is really useful when arguing with someone that holds to contradictory views, especially when they don't see the contradiction. Usually people are unwilling to hold on to a contradiction once you've pointed it out to them. So suppose someone believes that, they have like a dozen cookies, but they also believe that they have 13 cookies. Maybe they're just confused about the meaning of the word dozen or something like that. Well, because 1 dozen refers to the same amount as 12, we can show that this person's beliefs ultimately reduce to an absurdity. This is a form of argument that's called reductio ad absurdum, and you can use non-contradiction in order to show reductio ad absurdum. And then if you can show that an argument ultimately leads to an absurdity, then you can safely reject that conclusion. So, for example, take Chad here. Chad believes that he has a dozen cookies. He believes that he has 13 cookies. We know that 1 dozen cookies is 12, and that 12 is not 13. And Chad also knows that 12 cookies is not 13 cookies. Now, from this set of beliefs and facts, we can see what follows from Chad's beliefs, right? Chad believes that he has 12 cookies and that he does not have 12 cookies, right? Because he knows that 12 is not 13, and so if he thinks that he has 13, then he believes that he doesn't have 12. So ultimately, Chad believes something that is contradictory. He believes that he has 12 cookies and that he doesn't have 12 cookies. And ultimately, all contradictions are absurdities. If you tell Chad about the absurd thing that he believes, hopefully he'll change one of his beliefs, getting rid of the thought that he has 13 cookies. I mean, supposing that he only actually has a dozen. The second law of logic that we're worried about is the law of identity. The law of identity states that everything is identical with itself, right? So here we've got the classic A equals A. The law of identity is also sometimes called Leibniz's law, which basically says that for anything A, if it's identical with something, it must be identical with itself, then A must have all and only the same properties as the thing that it's identical to, because it's itself, right? The law of identity has to do with what's called numerical identity and not similarity. Numerical identity is what we're talking about when we say that something is numerically identical with itself. It has to do with the fact that the thing is one thing. Sometimes we will say that 2 things are identical or the same, but when we are talking about 2 things, we're not talking about them as being numerically identical. We're talking about them as being in some way qualitatively identical or being of the same type. So the best the easiest example here to see this is that the people on the top are wearing one shirt, one and the same shirt, right? They're wearing the same shirt, whereas the two guys on the bottom are wearing the same shirt, but it's not one and the same shirt. There's two different shirts that are of the same kind, that are of the same type. When we're worried about identity, when we say that two things are identical, we mean in the first sense at the top, right? The shirt that he is wearing and the shirt that she is wearing are the same shirt. They are identical shirts. It is one and the same. Whereas the shirts at the bottom, they are of the same kind, but they are distinct. They are different shirts. Now, how does identity get used? Well, generally it gets used in conjunction with the law of non-contradiction, and here's how. So sometimes there's cases in which there are seemingly two things, and people really aren't sure if they're the same thing, right? So there's this classic example about the planet Venus, right? Back in ancient times, before anyone knew that Venus was a planet and thought it was a star. In certain places in Greece, if you look at the night sky in the evening, you can see Venus. Similarly, if you look at the night sky in the early morning before the sun comes up, you can also see Venus. But you can't see it in between, right? It dips below the horizon in the middle of the night. And because it dips below the horizon and then rises again, they were unsure whether or not it was the same star, or the same, body of light in the sky. So they never really, they didn't know whether or not the thing Venus, well, the one at night they called it Hesperus, meaning the evening star, and the one in the morning they called it Phosphorus, meaning the morning star. And they didn't really they didn't know that Hesperus and Phosphorus are the same thing. But now, in order to determine whether two things are really one and the same thing, all you need to do is check all of the properties of both things. And if you find out that there's one different property between one thing and the other thing, then ultimately those two things are not identical. So basically we can look, like take this example. If we say that something has the property of being red, right? Say A is red, and there's another thing, B, that lacks the property being red, well, then it can't be that those two things are identical, right? A can't be B, because if they were identical, then we would have an absurdity. If they were identical, if A is red and A is identical with B, but B is not red, then we would end up with this absurdity via the law of non-contradiction, remember, that A is red and A is not red. The absurdity here is unacceptable and impossible given the law of non-contradiction. And so, the only kind of thing that can be identical with anything is itself. And in order to be identical with yourself, right, you have to have all the same properties that you have, right? It seems really, really straightforward, but it's actually extremely useful in logical thinking. Finally, we have the third law, and this one's rather interesting and straightforward, the law of excluded middle. The law of excluded middle says that for all the properties that there are, everything either has that property or doesn't have that property. Now remember, properties are just features, any way a thing could be, right? Take any individual thing, right, like a tree or your house or your car, and all of the features that thing has, right? The tree is such and such tall, it has so many leaves on it, right? The house is at such and such a location. Well, for every possible property you can think of, every individual thing that there is, according to the law of excluded middle, either has that property or it doesn't have that property, right? So take the property of being located in San Luis Obispo. Everything in the entire world is either located in San Luis Obispo or it isn't, right? It seems pretty straightforward. Similarly, everything in the world is either red or it isn't. Finally, everything in the world is either square or it isn't, right? Now, in action, the law of excluded middle is useful and similar to the previous examples. It ultimately just states that no property no object can both have and lack the same property, because that would result in an absurd contradiction, right? If we were to imagine a ball that is completely red and completely not red,
you get stuck, right? If you try to imagine that ball, you can't do it, right? It's not possible to actually imagine the same thing, one and the same thing, being both red and not red. Now maybe you can imagine two balls that are qualitatively identical. They're very similar, but they're not the same ball, right? If you're trying to think of one particular thing that both has and lacks the same property, you've lost it, right? And that's because that's ultimately a contradiction. These logical laws ultimately help us to set the limits of what's ultimately possible and impossible. That is, unless something violates a logical law, there is at least some sense in which that thing is possible, the logical sense. Things like cows can jump over the moon are logically possible. They are, of course, physically impossible, but that's neither here nor there. There's no logical contradiction involved in the idea that cows are able to jump over the moon, right? It's not that like cows somehow can and can't jump over the moon. That would be a contradiction. But in this case, it's while this is physically impossible because of the restriction on cow weight and how gravity works, they can't jump over the moon. But logically, it's possible. That you are currently the president of the United States. Well, that's logically possible, even if it's currently, impossible given our actual history up to now. I mean, unless you are Joe Biden listening to this, you are not the president of the United States, given the progression of our actual history. The furry creatures that slink around our houses that we call cats are actually a species of landfish. While this is something that could be that's logically possible, there's no contradiction occurring in this strange scenario. This situation is biologically impossible, right? There is no way that anything that's like a cat could actually be a species of fish. But that's according to how biology actually went, how things turned out in the actual world. Not just because of the way that logic works. Similarly, finally, and most absurdly, take me, Instructor Kyle. I suppose I'm a credit card account. Not a credit card account. Totally different things. That would be pretty crazy, right? I mean, ultimately, this is logically possible because there's no contradiction involved here, right? I don't violate the law of identity. I don't violate the law of non-contradiction, and I don't violate the law of the excluded middle in this strange scenario. That's not to say, though, that this isn't impossible in some sense. It's metaphysically impossible because no human person could ultimately be a credit card account. Those are two very different kinds of things. Everything in the end is logically possible, unless it violates a logical law, which will result in an absurd contradiction. Now, it's worth distinguishing the things that are actually possible and impossible, given all the ways that the world actually is, and the things that we merely know to be possible and impossible. As it turns out, there's going to be many more things that are actually possible or impossible right now that we don't know about, right? Because ultimately we are, limited beings that have to do a lot of experimentation in order to come to know things. This is what science is often in the business of finding out what's possible and what's not possible by doing experiments. Now, when science finds out that something is possible or not possible, well, it was always the case that thing was possible or impossible, right? It just now turns out that we have come to know that it's not possible or is possible. Now, there are also likely to be many things that we currently believe to be possible or impossible that will turn out not to be, right? Sometimes science gets things wrong, and sometimes something we thought that was like sometimes something we thought that was impossible turns out to actually be possible, or the other way around. Something that we thought was possible actually isn't. We can imagine sort of these examples. In the past, people thought that it was possible to take certain kinds of metal and turn them into gold. This is the process called alchemy. Alchemists, they would try to take things and melt them or make potions out of them, do something strange to them, and hope that it turned into gold. Now, it turns out in modern chemistry that it's impossible to make gold, right, out of anything other than gold, right? You can't turn one metal into another metal. So something that at one point people thought was possible turns out to be impossible. Currently, some physicists believe that time travel is theoretically possible, given Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, it may be, right? But it could also be that we could find out at some point in the future, as our physics gets better or develops, that time travel is actually impossible. And at that point, we could, right now, either time travel is possible or impossible. And that's consistent with whether or not we think the wrong thing, right? It's possible that time travel is possible, and yet we think it's impossible. Or it could be that time travel is actually possible, but we think that it's impossible. Now, given this whole very broad way of thinking about logical possibility and impossibility, it is going to turn out that many of the weirdest things that people believe are logically possible. Things like telekinesis or astrology, sorcery, ancient aliens, all are going to turn out to be possibilities, to be logical possibilities. But remember, logical possibility is extremely weak as a restriction on thinking. It's just not a very strong restriction at all. Literally, the only restriction that logical possibility places on anything is that it be consistent, that it not lead to a contradiction. Ultimately, if we're searching for what's actually true in the world, as we do when we're doing science or philosophy or just, exploring, we need to apply further methods that bring with them further restrictions to our thinking. We can't merely be looking for things that are logical possibilities. So, for example, someone believes in sorcery, and sorcery implies that someone can snap their fingers and cause something to happen miles away instantly. Now, that violates certain physical laws, like that nothing can go faster than the speed of light, that physical events must have physical causes. And so, ultimately, if we're committed to things like physics and the current best theory of physics, then the physical laws as well as the logic, we need to take both the physical laws as well as the logical laws on board when in our thinking and reject sorcery. The logical laws are not enough on their own because sorcery isn't something that is illogical in a sense, right? It doesn't lead to a contradiction. It's only that when we take logic plus other scientific fact that it turns out that we have a conflict between, what someone thinks that believes in sorcery and what we think if we believe in physics. This leads to sort of one of the main takeaways here. Just because something is possible doesn't mean that you should believe it. There's a large gap between the fact that something is possible and whether or not that thing is probable and whether or not that thing is even plausible enough to believe in. Sometimes there are things that are probable, but you shouldn't, you shouldn't actually believe in them, that they're going to happen. Take the JFK assassination, right? It is certainly possible that Lee Harvey Oswald was not involved, and that the two men on the grassy knoll actually shot Kennedy. It's also possible that the FBI was involved in a massive cover-up, and that the deep state was out to get Kennedy because he was too liberal. Now, just because all these things are possible does not mean that we should believe them. In fact, I don't think anyone should believe them, even the people that put these conspiracy theories forward. They shouldn't believe them. And the reason is not because, you like the conspiracy theory or dislike the conspiracy theory. The reason is that there's evidence against these theories. There's good evidence involving the way that things actually turned out. And as the evidence stands, it would be improbable for all of these other situations to have occurred. While surely it's possible, it's improbable that things happen differently than people, seem to have agreed they happened. And insofar as it's improbable, it's implausible to believe that something else happened, like these conspiracy theories. What I hope you have learned from this lecture and thinking about this is that the notions of possibility and impossibility ultimately depend on context. Also, that some things ultimately are always impossible, right? That sometimes, if something leads to a logical contradiction, then that thing simply is not possible at all. I want you to remember the three laws of thought, the three laws of logic: the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and the law of excluded middle. And I want you to sort of recognize that just because something is possible in one sense or another doesn't mean that you should believe it, because while mere possibility may be a good starting point for our beliefs, more evidence is needed to really show that something is plausible or probable.